Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. As always, we have with me, directly over on that side, Mala Mahadevan. How you doing, Mala?
Good evening, everyone. How are you? I'm doing well.
Doing fantastic. Anders is apparently also doing fantastic with the new farming simulator game coming out. So probably even more lifelike livestock. And sometimes with us, and we're glad he's here today, from the mountains of northern Georgia, we have Mike Christensen. How you doing, Mike?
Very well, thanks. Hello.
So Mike's on vacation, but he decided to stop in here and spend some time with us. So we're glad he was able to make it. And we have Lysanki in chat saying those people are still at the malls and Walmarts asking people why they're viewed as the worst provider. So I think this is the earliest that I've gone on a rant, on a completely non-tangential rant. I actually even have things in the agenda to talk about tonight, but I gotta go on this rant. When North Carolina started rolling out broadband, essentially what happened was at roughly the county level, or at least the city, the township level, you saw companies get essentially monopolies over the area. The first company to install lines got to basically own that town. And as a result, there's a rather striking lack of competition for broadband in this state. Because in a lot of states, you'll usually have two cable providers. Quite often, they'll run two separate lines. You'll usually have two or three DSL providers. Admittedly, they're running over the same copper. They're running over the common carrier phone network lines. Quite often, the cable providers are running over the same fiber as well. But in North Carolina, essentially it was, well, Time Warner, you got this county because you were the one who agreed to install lines. And AT&T, you get this county because you agreed to install lines out there. And as a result, even if you want to switch, there aren't many choices. So I could go looking in my area and I get Spectrum. What else can I get? Actually, I don't think I can get anything else. For a little while, Verizon was offering Fios in this state, but then they pulled out, which I think again was due to a gentleman's agreement. And as a result, there's a reasonable amount of competition at the state level, but essentially no competition at the house level. Google Fiber promised that they were going to come in and install fiber across the Triangle area, and they got about 5% of the way in, and for various reasons didn't finish the job. Some of those weren't Google's fault. Some of them were bureaucracy being bureaucracy, but others were Google essentially saying, you know what, we don't really need to do this, so we're done. And they ran some line in Raleigh. They got partially to Durham, but didn't get to my house. So that's the part that really upset me. So that's my first rant of the day, and it's essentially you don't really have that much in the way of options. There is the concept of over-the-air gigabit, which I think will get a little more popular. I know that there was at least one company who was pushing for that in the Triangle area. I know that Google talked about that, well, instead of laying lines, we could use the lines that we have, but then also use gigabit over Wi-Fi, essentially.
It'll also heat your house.
What's that, Mike?
It'll also heat your house at that frequency.
So Anders says living in RTP is good. Right, if you're in the Morrisville area, then you'll have several options. And he jokingly says Starlink. If you're in a rural area, Starlink is actually a really exciting prospect. Because as you get further out, satellite becomes your only option. And you're at, what, 5 megabit right now, Mike?
Yes. Yep, satellite, yeah.
Right, and that's normal. That's about normal for a lot of satellite options. It's also pretty expensive usually. So I am very interested in what Starlink can do and seeing if that could be a legitimate option outside of very rural areas. So is it because they were labeled as a utility that they were allowed monopoly behaviors? Part of it is the utility, yes, that they're laying infrastructure lines, and there have always been special relationships with different government entities and major carriers, major infrastructure carriers. So going back to the phone system where you had Ma Bell, even after they broke up the Baby Bells, you still had kind of regional relationships where this was the phone company. And in return for that effective monopoly over landlines, over being able to install wires, they got those special privileges and had certain restraints as well. So, for example, they were forced common carrier, meaning that they couldn't prohibit another company from competing on their same lines. They had to offer up other companies to lease those lines and at effectively a common rate. So you may have competition in that sense where you'll have multiple competitors who are angling. They can't necessarily angle on price terms unless they have less overhead, but they can on service. More frequently, what we ended up doing was everybody just switched to cell phones. So nowadays, landlines a lot less important. But same thing did happen for cable companies and fiber. And yes, so it's not necessarily that they're labeled utilities. It's that they are infrastructure requiring significant, or excuse me, they are utilities, but that they're requiring significant infrastructure outlays, which usually involves digging in everybody's houses or running lines over people's property. And that's where the different states or the different municipalities will come to an agreement because they don't necessarily want 5 or 6 separate fiber lines that are all running the same area. So holding off on where to move until Starlink settles down. That is actually a fair point, especially if you are in a rural area or you're thinking of going to a rural area. And if Starlink ends up being a useful technology, as useful as we're thinking, then that can open up the door for a lot of tech workers who are in quite rural areas. Check out what the franchise fee on your cable bill is for. That I'm not positive about, so you would have to explain it unless I already said it on accident. Latency is a killer. How do you do DNS? If you're in a rural area, like you're working off of satellite, latency is a killer. Yeah, I mean that's why they don't have much in the way of online gaming for people who are kind of deep out there, because you'll have 200 plus millisecond ping time sometimes. So even if your total bandwidth is decent, if you're constantly refreshing pages, you'll feel that. It's a lot better if you're streaming something, so you can watch movies just fine over satellite. It'll take you a little longer to get started, a couple more seconds, but you can watch it just fine as long as you have enough bandwidth. But it's where you have games that are constantly updating where you really struggle. Many people are too young to remember long distance charges. No, I remember that. And local call charges. Yep. So, franchise equals paying the government for right of way. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so we got off on that tangent. Let's redirect ourselves so that I can jump off on another tangent in 3 more minutes. In the meantime, Mala, you had an event this past weekend.
Yes, we decided to take a bit of a risk, and my co-organizer Kathy, who co-runs the WIT group with me, was a little nervous about it. We decided to dedicate a day to mental health and wellness. In the light of everything going on, we thought it would be appropriate to not do yet another tech event, and put on something different. And she was a little nervous, and I was also a little, not too sure how it's going to go, but we are not spending any money or anything. We decided to give it a shot. I reached out to a few people who I felt were being open about their challenges and asked them to submit, which they did. And our event went off like really well, like phenomenally well, way better than I thought it would. Every class had a minimum of 40 people. Some classes had up to 60 people. We had a very long day because I had personally requested so many people to submit, and I didn't want to turn down anybody. We accepted all the sessions we got from community. We got a few sessions from outside the community, and those we said no to, because we are not, personally, we are, the SQL community is our main audience, and the people who submit from there are the first people we're going to be looking at. So even with the submissions just from the community, we had sessions going from 8 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the evening. And all of them, literally all of them, were packed. And the feedback was excellent. I mean, it wasn't a regular kind of an event for people to be critical about what speakers could do better and such. Most of them were personal stories, with a lot of tips and various suggestions, but still. But it went extremely well. The speakers were very happy to have a stage where they could talk about certain difficulties they've been undergoing, and the audience was very appreciative. So we learned some lessons too. We learned that it's worth taking some risks, and we also learned that we get a good turnout if the sessions are new, which is nothing surprising there, but it worked really well. Overall, the event was phenomenally good. And the recordings will be out on YouTube next week. All the speakers have agreed to publish theirs. So soon as it's done, I will post the playlist here in the next shop talk. I think by end of this week, we should have it ready. So I know Anders was there. If anybody else was there that I don't know about, thank you for attending and for making our event such a big success.
Great. Glad to hear that it turned out well. And so you have no official plans for the next one. I know you talked before the stream about unofficial plans, so I'm not going to hold you to that.
We are planning on a tech event for sure. But anybody has any ideas, most welcome. We are not sure what to theme it around yet. And it's going to be, for this one, we took a deviation. We allowed people, anybody to submit. Next one will be, because we are a WIT group, it's going to be restricted to women-only submissions.
That's fantastic.
All right. So next, I want to talk about upcoming events with the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So tomorrow night, we've got Jeff Moden reprising a role on, this time it's not so much necessarily about unique identifiers and index fragmentation. It's about LOBs, large objects, and how poorly they can perform. So should be an exceedingly interesting talk. That's tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time here on Twitch. Then, next Tuesday, so that's the 18th, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we've got Leslie Andrews, who's giving a talk on Azure Data Factory. So this is a nearly brand new talk, gently used talk from Leslie. I think she's only done it a couple times before. So should be exciting. Introduction to Azure Data Factory on next Tuesday. Now, next Thursday, we've got a special talk. It's special in the sense that Tracy and I completely dropped the ball and accidentally double booked. So Thomas Grosser was kind and patient enough to allow us to reschedule him to Thursday, May 20th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, where he's going to talk about scaling SQL Server beyond 2 CPUs. That'll be a very in-depth advanced DBA level session. So we're going to have 2 of those this month. And on the 25th, that last Tuesday of the month. Shabnam Watson will talk about publishing and sharing content in Power BI. We have a packed schedule this month, each of the next 3 Tuesdays plus a bonus Thursday. In the meantime, another episode of Shop Talk in 2 weeks. So I wanted to make sure that we got those all mentioned. All of the meetup invites have gone out. Meetup.com/tripass, TRIPASS, in case you are not quite familiar with it. And that's where you'll get basically the link to come back here. So you can also follow us here on Twitch, and that way you'll know when we go on the air. So next, got a topic for discussion, and chat, I want to hear your thoughts. I've got thoughts, surprisingly. I have opinions. But this is a slightly older article from Grant Fritchie a few months ago, talking about build versus buy with tooling. And wanted to get some ideas from people. The gist of it is, when it comes to building tools as an administrator, as a developer, as anything in that data platform space, should you take the time to build out custom tooling? Should you buy off-the-shelf tooling? And under what circumstances should you do both? So, Mala, you had the idea originally. And Mike, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts as well, especially as you're not necessarily a person who's spent a lot of time as a DBA.
So there are a lot of things that go into this. I don't think it's an easy answer. And in some cases, I would also think, or at least I think in every case almost, what the organization wants to do is also part of it, because building an in-house tooling takes away from the time and effort that the employees have to put in. And depending on how much you're tasked with as an employee, you may or may not have that time. I have worked in shops where I simply did not have any time for building anything cool. I mean, I had so much operational work to take care of, everyday work, that there really wasn't enough time. So in those places, I recommended, hey, you buy something now. You either you give me time to do it or you buy something. Now, where I work currently, they are very much in favor of having, building their own tools, because not just because, we have a lot of special requirements that off-the-shelf tools simply cannot meet, but also because, they like their employees coming up with our own solutions and, writing cool code and stuff like that. So the philosophy here is very much favorable towards writing your own code. So I like that, and it works for me, so it works like that. But it's not something that's going to work everywhere you go. It's a trade-off and what the company wants to do in some ways. Second thing is also that whether or not your requirements may be met by anything off the shelf, or to put it in another way, what percentage of your requirements can be met by a third-party tool? Yes or no? Or is it worth the money that it's going to cost? So those are the things that typically I would consider. And another category of this, perhaps in BioBuild, is also open source tools. There is so much of those now. And very recently, we looked into one. I won't name what the tool is. We looked into one for some of our needs that was open source. And, we spent nearly a month on it trying to customize it for our needs. And really, we found it is not worth this effort. We are better off writing our own. So I would classify open source tools as somewhere between build and buy. And in some cases, depending on when the last pull request was, you can determine if this thing is supported well or not, and maybe worth it. In some cases, it's really not. So that's my 2 cents on the topic.
Yeah, I'd rate that as at least 3 cents. Yeah, no, that's a really good summarization of a lot of the trade-offs. What do you think, Mike? Before I get to chat.
I definitely think that there's a tendency towards buy for a lot of things that software companies that specialize get very good at what they do, and if you can get things for a reasonable price, they can really save a lot of time. In coming to the SQL Server meetings, our team implemented two items that they had not heard of, And so that added a lot of value in our shop. So that was fantastic. It was SSI Components Plus, and I forgot the other one. Yeah, we actually had licenses for Aqua Data Studio, which is a sophisticated tool. You would necessarily build your own Azure Data Studio or SSMS, but we're starting to use DB Beaver to save money, so that we can be cross-platform. But of course, we use SSMS, and I use Azure Data Studio. So I think that definitely there's compelling reasons to really look at buying or using open source, and then building something internally is how can you handle the technical debt? So you have to think about expertise and what kind of people you have in your shop who can actually make and maintain products that you just don't get orphaned. So I biased a little bit towards buy.
Right. So, all right, let's see what chat says. First, Anders nails it with, oh boy. I think that's the appropriate initial response to this discussion. So Enhanced QC, my experience with devs and dev work, it's always twice as expensive and takes twice as long as what the devs say. They also always end up thinking the devs own the business and can make decisions of yes or no, dismissing what the customer wants. Yeah, I think that's a fair comment in both regards. Twice as expensive and twice as long may even be understatements. Especially when you're talking about, I can build a tool like this. I mean, I've had that feeling as a developer where I see a product and I say, I can build something that's better than what's available here. And technically, maybe I can, maybe I can't. Probably I can't build something that's better than the whole thing. But a big question is, can I build something that's better at serving my needs or the needs of my company? And that's where things get a little murkier. I do agree that it would take quite a bit longer than what you as a developer might initially think, because quite often you're going in there guns a-blazing, and it's not with the same level of preparatory thought that you'd hope to get in a business project for the company. So that is a good point. Solomon, if software exists that meets needs and is reasonably priced, then buy. Why waste time building? Building requires support as well. Also, we work for software companies. How would our companies do if everyone had the mentality of build everything and then expect others to not have that same philosophy so that we have customers? Agreed completely on, if you've got software that's there and is reasonably priced, buy it. Building does require supporting. Building definitely requires maintenance over time, and Anders has a point that buying means that there's somebody to help you out when you move on, or to help out when you move on. So you don't get those emails after you leave that say, I know you're not with the company anymore, but could you help us out with this thing? And you simply say, well, they've got a support team for this. So those are absolutely reasonable assertions. Anders also says, Mala, but your DBAs are crazy. Legally speaking, they're mashuga. They're not crazy. So let's see. Then again, my company bought 515 Century 1 licenses, which at market value is a lot of dollars. And that's one of the things that I've had to think about over my career, because I've never really worked for a company that had a real budget, or what you would imagine as a real budget. I've always had to fight for pennies, and as a result, the buy build calculus has been skewed historically for me, because I can't afford to buy a product for this. I have to build something, even if I understand that there are better products available. Or I have to use an open source product because I just don't have budget to implement something more appropriate, even if there is something more appropriate. And, some of that have to is mental, where I just don't want to have to go through the rigmarole of trying to get capital expenditures. Usually we're at the point where we're not talking about $500 for a piece of software. We're usually talking 5 digits, 6 digits, sometimes 7 for software and licensing. And there's where you have to really fight for years. And usually I don't win those fights. So my philosophy tends to be more on the build side out of necessity than out of necessarily desire to build. So Mala says that's the thing. If you're an operational DBA and you want a GUI-based tool like SentryOne, you're better off spending money on it. Absolutely. That's one of the key advantages that you'll see in those products. And I've bought products simply because I like their user interfaces. When you're talking about a monitoring tool, when you're talking about an administrative tool, that user interface is quite useful. Especially, I just want to be able to observe. Like if it has a nice dashboard view, I want to be able to observe, is everything looking okay right now? Yes, fantastic. I've built my own dashboards as well. Again, going back to, haven't always had the money to do things. And those dashboards will be something like Power BI, just running Power BI desktop or using Power BI report server because it was available. And kind of goes to, you use what you've got. Enhanced QC, let's build everything in assembly. Let's not. The plus side is that the executable will be 200 kilobytes. The minus side is it'll take you 9 months to build that. Like it's just a drop down. Yes, but it took me 9 months to build it. Anders says, although those emails have made me a lot of money over the years. Right, if you can swing a consulting contract. But then if you're working for a company that's too cheap to buy something, they may be too cheap to pay you to come back. They just say, figure it out. Oftentimes, the embedded development I'm in requires buy versus operating system. Is that close enough for problem space or a separate topic? Yeah, I think that's definitely apropos. Excuse me, buy versus open source. I read OS as operating system. So buy something or open source, build isn't really much of an option. And yeah, if you're talking in that space, you know, there are certainly trade-offs of I'm going to use something that's been built open source. I'm going to use something that's commercially built. There you're talking a lot about support. You're talking about expectations for how updates happen, how frequently updates happen, and whether your updates are liable to get pushed in. I call open source a double-edged sword, as it costs relatively little to use, but might cost everything if it's broken at a fundamental level. And over time, an organization can work with a developed tool or tool chain for a long time with expert knowledge on how to evolve it. That is one advantage within an organization, that if you do go that build route, you can get a lot of expertise in the specific tool chain and really apply it to the specific problems of a company. As a user, by which I mean, say, a developer or a database administrator or whatever, this has its pluses and negatives because you become a little bit of a fachidiot. You become somebody who is so specialized in this one thing that you lose track of the rest of the world. That I am an expert in this tool chain. Great, who uses that tool chain? Exactly this one company I'm working at. And for a less extreme version of that, you have mumps. Mumps is a database language that is only used by a relatively small number of hospitals. And pretty much nobody else. Because, my goodness, is it awful. Mike, you look like you've had experience with mumps.
Yeah, so the main leader in the hospital space software is Epic's. Epic is all in mumps. Started in the 70s, I guess it came out at MIT, but it's actually, since it's the market leader, it's actually pervasive now. So it's, I don't know, 70% of the hospitals use Epic, which is all based on mump.
It's spread. I did not know mumps was infectious. And that's your pun of the day.
Thank you.
Let's go back up here. We paid more in percentage for Century 1 than we do per core of SQL. Sometimes licensing ends up that way. And so, for example, I know that a few years ago, a company I worked for had a discussion with a vendor, and good vendor, good product. We wanted to use the product. When the cost came in, it's like, we're paying that much for all of our SQL servers. So we're not going to pay you to do for this thing. And then we just ended up building it ourselves. And you can get to cases where things are a little complex. Mala had to drop off. She has another pressing engagement at 7 o'clock. So that's why she just dropped there. Totally not because she wasn't contributing enough to us. No, but hopefully we'll see Mala again in 2 weeks. In the meantime, let me continue where I was going with build. Sometimes you do have specific requirements or specific difficulties that do put you in a small minority of companies, and that's where build can become a more interesting process. So, like, for example, if I have 60, 70 SQL Server instances, that by itself, not crazy. A lot of companies have hundreds of SQL Server instances, thousands of SQL Server instances. But when you then start talking about multi-tenant, I have 1,000 copies of this database spread across those SQL Server instances. And I want to figure out, I'm having a problem that is exhibited on one database on one server. Is that a problem local to that database? Is it a problem local to that instance? Is it a problem across everything and we just don't know it yet because it hasn't bubbled to the surface? And it's hard to tell. And all of the database monitoring products are based on the premise of focus on a database or on an instance. None of them have this idea of, I have a suite of databases that I want you to treat as roughly equivalent. So if you see a similar problem across a bunch of them, show that to me as a systemic problem that I need to fix. Versus if it's a single instance, maybe it's something that I can patch, like with a query store forced plan. Maybe I can fix that on that one database because it just happens to have a different structure of data. There's different SKUs of data because of the specific clients who are using that database. So by contrast, it could be that, no, this is a ticking time bomb that I've got to fix across the board. But understanding which of the two it is requires quite a bit of insight from the data platform specialists. And you can gain those insights, but the tooling hopefully would help you out. Now, the tooling doesn't typically help you out because it'll be, well, let's drill through these 1,000+ databases and see what each individual one has for findings. And no one's going to do that. Just be blunt with it. I don't care how much you paid for the tool. No one's going to do that. Enhanced QC says, I think my bosses always did a word replace in Word versions of our IT budgets, replacing the term training budget with no budget. Well, look,
Yeah.
you can train on your own time with your own money. Yeah, that's been something that's I've been critical about. I've left jobs because of lack of training budget. And my philosophy on that is, you want your people trained up. You want the best people that you can get. I don't want a bunch of untrained people who never progress in their careers, who never get better at what they're doing, because I need them to get better. I need to be able to maximize efficiencies, and training is going to help you do that. It's really short-sighted not to. If, as a DBA, you have time to build your own monitoring tool, you don't have performance problems. Maybe, maybe not. It could be that you don't realize you have performance problems. It could be that your performance problems aren't. I mean, I know that you're doing that tongue in cheek, but it could be that your performance problems are there, but they're more subtle. So you're doing okay. Maybe the answer has been throw more hardware at it, and at some point there's gonna stop being hardware to throw at it. Mala says most cases you have to do an evaluation for a seriously extended period of time for management buy-in for expensive third-party tools. I would agree with that. Some colleagues of mine are upset because SolarWinds DPA was removed and they were used to it. Requests came in for us to build it. Hey, if I can build something like that, why would I work here? I'd be selling that thing and making a lot more money. So that was Mala's thought on build versus buy. Mike, you said that Cozy Rock, SSIS Plus, and Bimmel. So you have something to buy and something to build.
Yes, we learned that from you guys.
Oh yeah, yeah. I still enjoy Bimmel. I haven't used it for a while, but that's because I haven't been in integration services for a while. But conceptually, it's a good way of turning a tool that was intended for drag and drop low code business experience users into something that will actually work in an enterprise. So what has more use, mumps or RPG? Well, Anders, based on what Mike says, apparently mumps. S1 is Sentry 1. Yeah, Sentry 1. Used to be SQL Sentry. SQL Sentry is the...
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's the
know
name of
that
the product.
Yeah, I saw S1 and then somebody had said S3, and I was like, wait a minute, are you guys talking about storage? I'm with you now.
Yep. Actually based just north of Charlotte. So that's where custom software comes in. Consulting anyone? Or you can ask Redgate for help. Yeah, so Raymond, custom software is a viable option. Take something that already exists, customize it, and sometimes you hire a third party to come in and extend it for you. They're in Charlotte after they moved headquarters. Yeah, I think they moved to the north side of Charlotte. I remember north somewhere in the discussion, but as far as customization goes, that can also get pretty expensive. But yeah, hire a company to develop something that is specific to your needs. And in certain domains, in certain contexts, that makes a lot of sense. Always throw more hardware at it. I get compensated by how many cores I have in production. I would not be shocked if that were the case, Anders. I would not be shocked if you worked that into your employment agreement. And also, he had the thing that makes me angry, but they might leave if you train them. And the response, of course, is yes, but if you don't train them, they might stay.
That's more wise.
Yeah, but granted, I've not had anybody on my team leave. I'm crossing my fingers that nobody's imminent to leave. But you train people, you make sure that people have everything that they need, you make sure that they have room to grow, and eventually, sure, they move on. It happens, but that's a good thing. That means you have successfully moved somebody to the next level. And guess what? You can bring in somebody else. You can train them up. Continue the process.
I would even say sometimes it really pays dividends because you know 5 years later that person might come back as a senior leadership member or a senior dev and come back to the company because you treated them so well, depending on what their career is or their spouse's career or what have you. But I've seen that happen a couple of times.
Oh yeah, that is a fairly common thing because I don't know how much people have this idea still in their minds, but that 1950s idea of you work your way up through a company, that you start off as a mailroom clerk and eventually make your way up into senior management. It doesn't happen very much in modern companies. Instead, to move up, you usually have to go out. So you may come back 3 years later. So basically, you might be a junior developer at one company, go somewhere else to become a mid-level or a senior developer, and spend a few years there, go somewhere else, take that next step up. And eventually, you may come back to your original company or to an earlier company at a higher level because they didn't have the room for you then, but you liked the experience and you wanted to come back. And also, like Andrew says, a certain amount of turnover is good. It does give the opportunity for new people to come in who haven't maybe bought in completely on the way things work here. So it can bring in new ideas. You have people who are not burned out. After a certain amount of time, there are certain activities that you'll only be willing to do for so long. And, well, you got a new person. New people, that kind of resets. That, okay, I know that this is a bad aspect of the job, but we need somebody to do it. Guess what? You get to do it because you're the new person. And eventually there will be a new person, and that new person gets to take it on. And in the meantime, the new person who gets this may find ways to improve it if there are processes that can be made better. And it also gives you a chance to potentially find even better talent than what you have today. As people ossify, they tend to stop learning after a certain point. Probably not the people that I'm talking to right here, because you're spending Monday evening chatting with us, so maybe you're not in this group. But there are quite a few people who, after a certain amount of time, let's say, I'm done learning. I've learned all I need to do for this job, and I'm going to coast. So those people can still be productive and valuable and worth the money you're paying them, but they may not necessarily get you more. You don't have those unrealized gains. And that's where fresher blood can help out. A certain amount of turnover is good. Yeah, I would agree with that. Ooh. Previous developers using social security number as a cookie ID. With zero turnover, we never would have found it. Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. There's also things that you can hide that maybe we shouldn't have done it this way. And then a new person comes in and, oh, yeah, that's not the way to do it. On a larger team, you need both learners and stability. Absolutely. If you have all new people, you can stunt their growth. If you have all people who've been there for 15, 20 years, their growth probably will be stunted as well, because there's a really good chance that they're not learning more, that they have become experts in their domain, and I don't need to learn more because I know the way that we create a .NET project is follow this 25-step checklist. Why would I need to know about Visual Studio Code? Why would I need to know about this other way of doing things? .NET 8, we're using .NET 3 and we like it because that's what I used 12 years ago and it worked just fine. And Enhanced QC says, yeah, about 10,000 sysadmins out there in that exact spot, refusing to tool into the cloud. Voltage will eventually kill the metal that is their jobs. In the really long run, maybe. I think, yeah, a lot of their jobs, a lot of the jobs of the click, click, click person probably go away in the next, say, decade. Maybe 15 years. If you're expecting your life to be click, 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 like George Jetson pushing the button, that's not the way that life turned out. On-premises versus cloud, different discussion. I think that on-premises, there will be a large number of companies who will live on-premises for good reasons. And There's a lot of push within Microsoft, within Amazon, within Google about go use the cloud for everything. And I think that in many cases, it makes a lot of sense to put a lot of things in the cloud. But in most cases, um, once your company reaches a certain size, it doesn't make sense to be entirely cloud based. There is a reason for the hybrid model. Okay. There is a reason for the hybrid model, is what they're all talking about now. Yeah, that's because when they tried the go use cloud everywhere approach, a lot of companies said, okay, we'll buy into this, put everything in the cloud, found out that their bill was 5 times as high, and said, what gives, Microsoft? And then Microsoft says, oh, well, you didn't follow all of our instructions. And you could have gotten down to just a 2x bill. Like, wait, why am I paying you twice as much then? One huge thing is patch stability, right? Where you may not control when patching occurs on your servers, and that could take a server down at a time when you don't want to. If you're 24/7 on machines, then you have to really rigorously control those patches. And if your service provider auto patches, then they can also auto restart, and that can auto screw you up. Or patch out something you rely on, even if it is a bug. Yeah. There are breaking changes in a lot of code. And even those bug fixes, you're right, they can affect something that you were expecting. They can introduce subtle new bugs. Yeah, there are, hey, don't install this patch because it broke something big. I mean, we saw that in SQL Server, where there were a couple of CUs where people said, don't install this CU because if you're using the SQL agent jobs, this is going to break. If you're using this piece of functionality, this is going to break. And if you have something that's auto patching, auto updating, you're out of luck.
Yeah, that's why I have an electric car and a gas car.
Yeah, that's.
You gotta have a hybrid.
That's an insight, Mike.
I'm here to help.
Raymond says, isn't high availability always turned on? Not necessarily. In a lot of cases, yes, but now you're paying twice as much because you got that high availability server. Defense/government, medical, manufacturing. Everything else, sorry, it's going into the mainframe or the cloud if you want to use 2021 parlance. Many things, yes. Many things, yes. But I think there's going to be a slower adoption of cloud for everything. And the reasoning I have for it kind of goes back to that point of, if you just take what's on premises and throw it into the cloud, your bill will, in all seriousness, probably be about 2 to 3 times as high as what it was on-prem. So a lot of companies look at that and say, nope, not doing it. You can get less expensive cloud services. If you have cloud native development, then yeah, you can find ways to reduce that bill and migrate off of on-premises solutions. And there are costs and benefits. There are some pretty good benefits to being hosted in a cloud service. So I see more movement in that direction, but I think there's still going to be a pretty large number of companies who will be on-prem for my work lifetime. I don't think it's going to be, like 95% of companies are in a cloud somewhere. I think it'll be that 95% of companies will have at least some services in at least one cloud, but that a large number of companies will still have servers in a data center or servers in racks in their buildings. That they'll still have their own physical hardware, and they'll continue to use their own physical hardware because it's cheaper that way. Going back to application development, if you take an app that was developed under the premise that I got to own this entire server and that essentially the servers are free, and you move that app into the cloud, it typically is very bulky. It typically is very chatty, and it ends up costing a lot of money as a result. And redeveloping that application in a way that makes a lot of sense for a cloud system might be beneficial, but it's more likely that it's not going to be beneficial enough to be worthwhile. So that's a big endeavor, a lot of development risk. You may be talking about a 20-year-old application and saying, with millions of lines of code, and saying, yeah, let's put this in the cloud. I don't think it's going to take off to the extent that we've been promised the last several years. But that said, I'm hedging my statement again by saying that I also don't think that there will be a lot of companies who will adamantly refuse to be in a cloud at all. I think what you're going to see is some of our apps are in this cloud, some of our apps are on premises, some of our database systems are up here, some of them are down here, and we'll use VPNs, we'll use ExpressRoute, Direct Connect in order to bridge those gaps. It seems.
Yeah, even
oh, go ahead, Mike.
Conservative. I would say in our space, and they're very conservative about that. Hospital and research institutions, and Harvard was kind of on the leading edge of using the cloud, and we lagged for years. But now we do use the cloud for some projects, but we're definitely what you said. We're still mostly on-prem, but we definitely do leverage some now, but unheard of even when I first started 4 years ago. They absolutely refused to do it, but they are doing it now.
Yeah. So Andrew says, then again, Netflix runs in AWS. That's true, but then Netflix was developed on AWS, and that's the difference that I'm getting at. When you're talking about applications that were developed on premises, they were built with those on-prem expectations in mind, and you have to redevelop them to put them in the cloud and have them work as fast as they were on-prem and without paying a ridiculous amount of money. So that's the trick. The fact that Netflix, yeah, you can host very large, wide-spanning applications and have entire companies that are cloud native. No doubt about that. And I think that number will increase. So, going to Enhanced QC's point, yes, that number of pure cloud players will increase. It is higher than it was a few years ago. It will be higher yet. But I think that there is a very long curve between pure cloud native and getting companies like more cloud friendly. And I think that within certain domains, not just government, medical, defense, there will be a lot of applications that I need this to respond faster than what I can get in a cloud. I need to have it more stable in terms of consistent speed than what I can get in a cloud. Thinking about extremely high-end financial stuff, I need to be able to run this thing on petabytes of data in a couple seconds. And network latency may be a couple of seconds when I refresh this page. I can't afford that.
What is a co-hosting? What is a traditional co-hosting site?
So that would be a data center where I'm going to buy rack space, or space in a rack, not rack space. I'm going to buy a rack somewhere in this data center, and within that cage, it might be 12 by 12 feet or 6 by 6 feet or whatever. I can put whatever hardware I want in there, and they host the stuff. They have the power, they have the cooling, but you're responsible for anything inside that cage. So if your servers blow up, you have to send a person out there.
Okay.
But we're hosting, so in that case, they would host a lot of different companies, and instead of those companies having to build their own data centers with their specific requirements, you can use one that somebody else has built.
Nice.
And I do think that a lot of those data centers probably will go away over enough time, but that there will still be co-hosted data centers. They will still be around. So Kubernetes and containers could become these new systems. Yeah, that's certainly making a move. And that's where you get to interesting solutions of I can be on premises and in a cloud. So it's all Kubernetes. I don't care if it's running in AWS or Azure or Google or on-prem. I can write my code and wherever it deploys. Figure out what's cheapest. And that's kind of where Microsoft is right now with Azure Arc, where they're trying to push that premise of go where you want to go, but still find a way to pay us money. They phrase it a different way, but that's what it comes down to. If you're doing anything real time, it'll be a long time until the cloud's ready for it. Yeah, network latency is a real problem. And I've seen cases where I expected this thing to be fast. Like I paid for this thing to be fast. And what ends up happening is that a lot of the time it's fast, but then it'll suddenly be slow for a little bit. And I have no insight into why was it slow? What can I do to make that faster? Oh, well, push this to increase the amount of money you're paying us, and then it'll be faster. Like, cool, but can you guarantee it'll be faster? No, but if you pay us more money, it'll probably be faster. Let's see. Solomon, my understanding was mainframes were hosting VMs and time-sharing CPUs back in the 70s. We've just come full circle. Oh, I'm firmly of the belief that the cloud is a mainframe. And there is nothing new under the sun. Yes, we even had this debate. So Solomon, time is a flat circle. How many times have we had this discussion, officer? Yeah, we even talked about the whole bit about nothing new under the sun. And yeah, I think that we are essentially coming full circle. It is hosted. It's hosted in a different way. The services are obviously different. The ways in which we operate are different, but many of those concepts of time sharing slices of CPU off of centralized servers, the premises are similar enough that I think it's a good metaphor. Let's see. Large is a relative term. Most companies will want to go CapEx versus OpEx. And companies externalize costs and internalize profits. The cloud is going to comprise 90+% of data centers out of business. Large is a relative term. I would agree. And yeah, I would also agree that, CapEx and OpEx is an important consideration. I think that that's made a little bit too much of especially now, mind you, I live close enough in the Microsoft world where I hear enough of their sales pitch and how much they focus on, well, you can use OpEx with us instead of CapEx. And so from that perspective, where I'm constantly hearing OpEx, 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 I think that pushes things a little too far. There are a lot of cases where I want CapEx. Companies, so for cheap things, for very low prices, I want to get into the cloud. Look, it's only $50. Great, I can OpEx that. And I only have to fill out one form, and it's part of one bucket in my budget. Whereas for CapEx, I have to go to accounting, and I have to go to the CFO, and I have to justify my decisions. But CapEx is also something you can amortize over several years and make consistent in your purchasing decisions, so you get budget certainty. That's the other side of CapEx that we don't typically talk much about. And when you're not able to take those tax deductions on amortized purchases of large equipment, that actually does affect the bottom line for certain companies. So storage and application comms are different for cloud native. Yeah, they can be quite different. Rackspace and company, those would be stepping stones potentially before moving to pure cloud. Hybrid, perhaps. Rackspace is trying to rebrand as a cloud company for a reason. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a more exciting answer for them. And yeah, I'm not saying at all the cloud is a fad. It'll be there. It will grow. I think more companies, especially newer companies, the bias will actually be toward cloud development because it is cheaper to get started. It's cheaper to just set up some cloud services than to try to get space in a data center. You don't have to hire those administrators quite as early on. So for many companies, that bias will push for quite a while. But there are a lot of companies that are either not in the cloud at all or have just taken baby steps in there. And that's the majority of the marketplace. I mean, if you think about the chasm, the leaders and laggards chasm, and I think we're at the point where we've just crossed that chasm. We've just jumped across it. But that's still if you take that bell curve shape, where the chasm is the big jump between those early learners, the early adopters, versus the laggards. These folks are just getting into the cloud. There's a lot left for them, and I think that's going to take a lot longer than people may realize at first. Ultimately, cloud does one thing: flexibility. Yeah, they do flexibility and also availability. I think the availability story is something that, if you've got the money, makes a lot of sense. Great. I don't need to figure out how I'm going to get a data center in Germany and a data center in Japan and a data center in the US. I click a few buttons and everything's replicating out to it, and I don't have to think about it. So in that regard, oh yeah, that's really cool for a company if you have the need and are willing to pay the money for it. And again, going back to, I've generally worked for pretty cheap companies in terms of how much money they're willing to spend on a lot of stuff. So high availability and disaster recovery aren't always fully funded. I'll put it that way. So for systems that want to go cloud and need support, distributed work, what would be a good, fast, and cheap alternative? Well, if by fast you mean fast performance and cheap and expensive, build it cloud native. Have the understanding of what the right services are for the solution. And when I say build something cloud native, usually it means distributed and messaging based, because messaging systems tend to be very inexpensive in the cloud. And you want something that's distributed. You don't want a single piece, so that all of your server sizes can be kept really small and you can process a consistent amount of work. So that way you don't necessarily have to build up to a higher scale level. So you kind of push a consistent number of messages instead of heavy spikes. And that maximizes your compute performance, because basically you can stay at this tier instead of having to move up to that tier because occasionally you spike up there. I've doubled the number of SQL servers in the past 12 months due to growth. There is no way I could have done this if I needed to purchase hardware for each of them. Sure. I think you're right on that, Anders. It's definitely a lot easier to get rolling up. And it also stops one of the problems that you have with CapEx, and that is that there is usually a long lead time. You usually have to plan that stuff 12 months, 18 months in advance. So, yeah, that's the downside. And it has enough corresponding upsides that I don't think it's a slam dunk decision that every company everywhere go out to the cloud. But I take your point that when you need that flexibility, that is one of the advantages you get, at the cost of it usually being more expensive than what you could do if you built it on premises. And some of that also comes down to how good you are at planning. So if if the company knows that it's going to double in a 12-month period, you got to get rolling on that. And so for the flexibility you get, you're paying for essentially not planning as well. Event processing stream-like database, Kafka-like. Yeah, Kafka has become extremely popular, and also in the AWS world, you have Kinesis, and Azure, you've got event hubs. Confluent obviously has their own version of Kafka as a cloud service, but those types of messaging systems have become extremely popular. Another advantage of them is that you can replay, you can retry. Cloud services really put that emphasis on the idea that, look, services will fail. When you're on-prem, when everything has microsecond latency, you can pretend that your network is perfect, that nothing will fail, and just develop expecting that everything will be there. Your SAN resources will be there. Your servers will be there. Your databases will be there. When you start developing cloud services, you realize those were all lies that we told ourselves to make things simpler. But now we can't act that way. We have to develop with the expectation that this thing will fail, and we have to be able to handle that failure gracefully. Okay. Let me see if there's anybody else here in chat. Enhanced QC says, most metal on-prem is spec'd for a time frame or time window that is really small. About 5 years. 3 to 5 years, typically. Andrew says, needed 4 terabytes for a project last week. Spun it up for the 3 days I needed it. Yeah, I mean, that is, again, that flexibility is a nice advantage. And it is hard to plan for a real estate market booming like crazy when everyone expected it to tank. Sure. Yeah, that wasn't, mind you, that wasn't me casting shade at you, Anders. But in a lot of cases, you can plan with contingencies, with expectations, and say, I'm going to expect this percent, and then because the capital expenditure is pretty high, I'm going to go a bit higher. I'm going to go twice as big or 50% larger or something like that, so that I handle that sort of overage. Okay, no, I meant the load, says Enhanced QC. You were talking about messages and spikes. A lot of companies end up buying metal to make their backup windows smaller. The spike or load they're spec to is small. Okay, I get you. I think I get you now. Cloud is great for system dynamics as long as funding is there. Yeah. So, all right, this took us through the end of Shop Talk for today. We're technically a few minutes over. Fortunately, we don't have anything after this, so it's not like another show where we had to get cut off. I appreciate everybody in chat, your thoughts on this. It's great conversation, considering that we started out build versus buy, and we ended up talking the future of cloud. Not too bad. Only one rant. Yeah, I didn't even have time for any more rants, Anders. You guys filled it all up. You did great today. So
anytime I hear someone say bare metal, I'm a happy guy. What do you guys say?
So, all right, we are gonna catch you on Shop Talk in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from today. Tomorrow, again, Jeff Moden talking about lobs, large objects in SQL Server. That's going to be exciting. So check that out tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Hope to see you there. In the meantime, everybody, have a great evening.
Night.